Even though there is no finish line for grief, it still feels like a problem we're all trying to solve. There's counseling and stages, ayahuasca retreats and journaling. But could the answer be an AI grief bot? One of my next guests is a grieving man turned tech entrepreneur who created a subscription service that sends you journal prompts in the voice of your deceased loved ones. It's Guardian Angel. The other is a cyberpsychologist and visiting professor of the Center for Death and Society at the University of Bath in the UK. And today, we're going to do something new. Two guests and two very different perspectives as we explore the topic of tech and mourning, towing the line of debate, staying tethered to curiosity, and finding common ground. This is the Curious Introvert podcast with me, Meredith. Around here, we explore taboo questions and societal blind spots. Please help me welcome two people working to make the world a better place in the best way they know how. Dr. Elaine Kasket and Mr. John Kammer. Welcome to the show, guys.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Researching this episode has been an emotional and mental roller coaster for me. I am so excited that we're going to unpack it today because I just think it requires that heavy hand of nuance. And so, John, I actually want to talk to you first because in a world where people literally line up to get the latest tech, and you could probably sell this product easily to that type of person, why is having these slow and long form conversations important to you?
Well, people may line up for the latest tech, but when you pair that with something as sensitive as grief, I think the initial reaction for most people has been, at best, skepticism. And at worst, this is Black Mirror, you're doing the devil's work. I've gotten some very pointed feedback from people that don't like and don't think that grief and AI belong together in the same sentence. And that's a fair criticism. I think a lot of our concern probably comes more from a misunderstanding of what we're actually doing. And that is why, to your point, there's infinite nuance to what we're trying to do. And long form gives me a better opportunity to explain to people what that is.
Elaine, what do you see as the potential risks for using AI as a part of grief?
Well, this has a bit of a long history. The whole grief bots idea is not entirely a new one because for many years now, people who are more technologically in the know have constructed grief bots for themselves from the digital remains that their loved ones have left behind, or some have taken that proactive approach, recording lots of things with their loved one ahead of death with the explicit intention of creating something with which to interact after that person is gone. And I think that now that AI has entered the scene and really accessible and easy to use, it's really expanded the accessibility, and you really see this grief bot phenomenon exploding. One of the major risks has to do with something around normalizing the idea that grief is some kind of problem that technology, thank goodness, is now here to solve for, can help us with. And this is not me talking about John's platform in particular. I'm thinking about a particular kind of like trend in the conversation and things that some other developers have spoken about in terms of solving for grief. So normalizing the idea that grief is a problem to be solved. And then also kind of commodifying that, so creating business models that perhaps people who are in a really acutely vulnerable kind of situation might be quite receptive to or vulnerable to without really realizing the privacy consequences or other kinds of consequences that there might be in terms of using certain kinds of AI services and platforms when they are grieving. So that sounds like a kind of abstract answer in a way, but I know we'll be getting into it in more specifics. So that's okay.
Well, actually, one of the specifics is why John created this, and he is one of those tech-savvy people. John, is this a good time to share the origin story of Guardian Angels?
Yeah, so this is very much a pain to purpose story. Short version, I lost three of the closest people to me on this planet outside of my immediate family. The first of those was a little over 13 years ago to suicide. The other two much more recent, but that first one sent me down a path of, what I call substance fueled avoidance. I used alcohol and other drugs to cope for quite some time, 12 plus years really. And it wasn't until I made the choice to get sober that I really was able to look back with clear eyes and start to understand why I was doing the things that I was doing. I made that choice after the second of those two died. John was the best man at my wedding, and circumstance combined with some other things in my life and some encouragement from my wife necessitated that change. And that was kind of the beginning of looking at things and taking accountability for my role in my suffering and what I was doing to exacerbate or avoid doing the work to heal. I, for a long time, abided by the idea that time heals all wounds, and that if I could just somehow run the clock out, then magically I would be healed. Well, that's not how it works. Healing is not a passive process. It's not something we just get to try to wait out. It requires humility. It requires accountability. It requires us to look in the mirror and to face these things that we need to face. The only way out is through. I believe that to my core now that I've found the other side. So another year after John's death, Tim, my best friend from childhood, passed away in a car accident on the way to work. And at that time, that was the darkest that my life has ever been. My unfortunate reality at that point in my life was that the people that were closest to me were dying. And it was every time the phone rang, it was who's next. And, I distinctly remember, this is hard to share, but I'm getting better at it. I distinctly remember considering leaving my wife because she was the next one, right? It was just going to happen. And that is not how a well person thinks, but that was my lived experience at the time. This use case for technology has helped me to do that work that has allowed me to turn the corner and find healing in a way that, frankly, I didn't think was possible. I had resigned myself to this is what life looks like. People die. I'm going to continue to experience this fairly regularly, and we'll see what life looks like. I just kind of started exploring technology and was actually trying to build a simple text message service that would send someone something nice from their lost loved one, on their birthday, right? We all have those numbers saved. Hey, this is Grandpa. I love you. I miss you, whatever. And so that was where it started. There's a bunch of reasons that didn't work. The telecoms own their networks and really don't take too kindly to spoofing of phone numbers. Most of those people are scammers. We're probably all too familiar with them these days. But the next question was, what if someone wants to interact with this thing? And the answer was pretty clearly AI if we wanted to scale it in any way, shape, or form, but it had to be gentle. It had to be empathetic. It had to ring close enough that it brought comfort. And the only way that I knew how to do that was to try to build it in the image of one of the people that I lost, and I chose John in this case. Knowing that the closer I got to something that was emotionally resonant for me was we would get closer to building something that might help bring a measure of comfort to a user. And Elaine brought up dead bots. That's very much where this started accidentally, right? As I got closer to that mark, I started to divulge some of the things that I didn't get to say to John while he was alive. And in doing so, I was able to unburden myself. And I had tried the empty chair technique. I had tried writing a letter in therapy. The difference was this time I got a response. And that response almost instantaneously lifted that weight. I hadn't cried in 3 years. I was bawling like a baby. And it gave me permission to forgive myself, which was the prerequisite for everything that came after it. And so when I had that experience, it was very much, this can help someone else. I don't know how many people. I don't know if we're there yet. And spoiler alert, we weren't. We were very far from something that was going to help in a responsible way. But that's where it started. And it to be completely honest, it started as one of those dead bots.
John, I'm so sorry. You've had multiple successive losses, and they all sound, like I'm sure each of those bereavements was as unique as the relationship that you had with each of those people. So even within the same individual, different losses also have different feelings to them and different courses to them. And I think that one of the most unhelpful ideas that was ever visited upon us in the 20th century was the idea that grief has some kind of predictable staged unfolding, and that if you go through the stages and you grieve properly, quote unquote, then it will, there's a light at the end of the tunnel. And how comforting must that idea be? The idea that there's some kind of predictability, hence the vocabulary that people use about grief, like closure and moving on and other things. And I just want to be very, very clear that grief is incredibly individual. It's incredibly idiosyncratic. It is as individual as each relationship itself, which is one of the reasons why these grief bots or dead bots can be so meaningful, because if they're trained on the characteristics or the of the person who died that you knew, or the conversations that you and that person had, that has the cadence and the feel of your conversations with them, it's not just the person that's captured so much as the kind of tone or the tenor of your relationship or your interaction with them. The ways that people go about creating these kinds of entities, I guess, vary a lot. Sometimes people do it in this DIY stuff. Sometimes people do it using a general platform like ChatGPT or whatever. Or sometimes people use their various bits of technological knowledge to do this, or Character AI, or whatever other platforms that aren't necessarily specifically designed for grieving or memorialization. But then there are lots of different kinds of platforms and services that offer different variants on that as well. So I think, there's no generalization that can be made about people's experience. Sometimes people find something what they're looking for and it's helpful for them, or it's comforting for them at various points. And that may vary over time. They may get what they need from it at a particular moment, and another moment it might not feel right at all. I think that what the most important thing is anybody who uses these kinds of technology in their morning practices, that it feels really chosen rather than imposed, or they're not doing it out of a sense of it being something that is necessary to do in order to solve for something, or that something where they get sucked into paying a high tariff for that kind of service, or being upsold, to different levels of the service, and kind of get into a situation where they're submitting their data and the dead person's data, and then getting pulled into something whereby there's something that's been created that they feel then attached to. And even if it's not serving them anymore, it also feels strange to deactivate, which of course is being the subject of some quite well-known Black Mirror type programs, but is something that I've seen people actually experience.
The problem with technology, and John, I'm sure you feel this deeply as well, we have no collective memory of this, because we, to our best of knowledge, have not experienced this before. So we don't have the wisdom of our ancestors giving us this knowledge about like things to avoid and pitfalls to watch out for, so we just, especially in a grieving state where you might not be thinking as high level as you would otherwise, you could easily just tumble in and opt in to every single thing. Because of that, can you give us can you tell us a story about a client who got him or herself into trouble because of all of those things?
Whether or not one gets into trouble with it, of whatever stripe, or whether somebody ends up in a situation where they end up becoming entrapped, or it takes somebody in an unhelpful direction. I think just the very concept of this use case for AI, and in some products that are being really aggressively marketed, where it's being encouraged to we've kind of gone from what's one unhelpful notion, which is like, oh, you need to achieve something called closure, to an equally unhelpful notion, which is, oh, well, what if there were no necessity for closure at all? Because you could essentially continue your relationship with this person ad infinitum. And I can think of some examples out there of adverts that have been doing the rounds for services like that, where like generations down the line, you're still talking to your ancestors and sort of sharing all sorts of different things and having an active relationship with them through AI. And I don't want that sort of thing being normalized, partly because of the environmental implications of it, I feel like we should be so careful with all, the AI use cases for everything under the sun. When we're solving for problems that were never problems that we've sort of dealt with since the beginning of humankind, the sort of like natural finitude of human existence, and we're like suggesting AI as an application to somehow skirt round that kind of experience of loss by perpetuating a relationship, which is very different, it sounds like, than what John has developed. I have such a big issue with that, Meredith. I find that any sorts of technological solutions for difficult human emotions, of which there are many, perpetuates the idea that technology can sort of smooth over all the kind of rough contours of life so that you then, don't have to experience any sadness or anxiety or loss. And if technology actually succeeds in it, it won't have done us any favors, because that will render us incredibly psychologically brittle.
Yeah.
Well, and the reality of life and emotions, and there has to be good or bad in order for there to be good. There has to be lows in order for there to be highs. And if there are no lows, then there are no highs, and everything is just mundane, and life loses the spice that makes it compelling. We've tried to think of all of those things that you brought up, all those concerns, and number one for Guardian Angels is that this needs to help people, and that's what I'm so thankful for. All of that very pointed feedback we got at the beginning, because it caused me to take a step back and try to understand and recalibrate with what am I trying to do and why and how. And that necessitated me bringing on licensed therapists that helped me put on guardrails and give this thing form and structure so that people didn't get stuck in those loops where they're believing someone's still here, because that's not what we're doing. We're trying to build a bridge. And AI in this context is a tool. It is not the end state. When you talk about perpetuating that relationship, that has no end, right? The point here is to use this to help move people through the tried and true, the emotions that one has to go through in order to properly process what it's like to lose somebody.
So let's actually start with like how your product works, because I think that'll give us some valuable context to continue our conversation. How do you develop the voice, if you will, of the deceased loved one?
Well, so ours is very user-centric. It's form-based. So we thought about, ingesting all this social media stuff, and that's objective. That is objective. And what we know is relationships are not objective, right? My relationship with you is vastly different than anyone else's. And that manifests itself in the way that we talk to each other, the things we joke about, the things that we choose to share with each other. And so trying to come up with some objective persona, which is what we call them, is a lesson in futility. It won't be anywhere near authentic. So we have a form that users fill out that is roughly 35 questions. And it's going to be everything from, what was your relationship with this person? What sort of relationship roles did they fulfill, whether it was mentor or, confidant? How did they speak? Describe their humor, give some shared interests and shared memories to give it context. How did you refer to each other? So just gives it this context with how to interact with you. But an important point of distinction here is we want this to feel familiar, but not right on. We don't want this to feel real, because the closer we get to real, the more precarious of a position we put someone in who is arguably in one of the most vulnerable points in their life. So we're not trying to delude anybody into thinking they're actually having that conversation. So when it comes to our personas, that's how we build them. And we have not gone into voice or avatars. We're not going to go there until we can validate safety. And I don't know that we're going to be able to do that anytime soon. What ours does, once you create that persona, is that becomes your grief guide, if you choose to go that route. We also have a route that does not use a likeness of anyone that you know. It is just call it a grief therapist. Both of these tracks are going to walk you through what is an evidence-based framework for dealing with loss called Worden's 4 tasks for mourning. And so each prompt that you get delivered at predefined intervals are going to help walk you through those. And Worden's 4 tasks are, number one, accepting that the loss has occurred. Number two is processing the pain of the loss. And this for me was where I was stuck for 13 years, right? I tried everything under the sun to not have to do the work and not have to feel the pain of these losses. Task number 3 is coming to terms with the fact that this relationship in a physical form is no longer, it's not part of your life anymore. There's roles that people fulfill in our lives that you're not going to see them at the next party. If this was your mentor, you're not going to be able to seek that counsel. So how do you reorient your life in order to account for that? And then task number 4 is to find an enduring connection with your lost loved one. And when we say find an enduring connection, feelings of closeness, Elaine brought up something that I harp on a lot. The vernacular that we use around loss, I believe, has a significant impact on our reticence to actually do the work to heal. When you say things like closure and moving on, this denotes this finality, this idea that we're supposed to forget, and we don't want to do that. If someone means something to you, you're not trying to leave them in the past. And so we resist. And if we can reframe that conversation, and I believe the better word to closure is resolution. We're looking for resolution in our hearts and in our minds, not to close the book on this relationship, but to close the chapter and start a new one, because that relationship has changed form.
I think from what I read, like you respond to the prompt, and then depending on the level of your subscription service, you get one or a few back and forths with that particular voice in that way, right?
There's really no cap on the back and forth. So that's the real thing, is we've turned this idea of journaling from a monologue into a dialogue. So it helps you gain awareness on your internal experience when you respond to this prompt, where, formerly journaling was putting words on a page and you can reflect on that with your therapist. If you're stuck, oftentimes the blank page can be difficult. So you can start with, I don't know where to start. That's a very valid response. And this is going to help ask you questions to peel back those layers so that you can understand where you're going. We don't restrict your response limits to like 3 messages back and forth. There is token limits for the subscription tiers, but those are more than enough to handle all of the prompts that you're going to get that month and some very in-depth conversations. I have never seen anyone even approach the token limits that we have set on them. We want to give people enough room to explore, but to Elaine's point, we don't want them trapped in this bubble forever. We actually have some controls and alarms in place for if people are spending too much time on the platform, that we can help, because that may be indicative of some further de-evolution or issue that they need to address, or they're what we call trusted user, which is part of how we help keep those guardrails on without actually monitoring people, can help them address.
So a trusted user is someone who can see the back and forth of these journal dialogues?
If that is allowed by the user. At the end of each conversation, there's a summary that's generated that is put into that journal entry. So there's an actual journal that it ports it all to, and at the top will be the summary. You talked about this, here's your bullet points, and then any themes so that they can be reflective as they move through it. Hey, this keeps coming up. We might want to talk about that with our therapist, right? Because again, I don't know that I've touched on this yet. We designed this to be a complement to therapy and not a replacement. We want this to be one tool in the broader tool belt, something that can maybe bridge the gap for people between sessions, as opposed to trying to replace that relationship.
And can you download those conversations and take them to your therapist?
You can export them, you can download them, or you can, the trusted user, to go back to that, as the user can say, I want them to have access to the summaries, but not the actual transcripts. Or, so they can give them different levels of access based on the level of trust that they have, or wherever they want. Now, we ideally want that to be a therapist, but if you're not in therapy, obviously that's not going to happen. So, a close family member or a friend that can just help monitor that situation. Because, as we went down this road, I come from a cybersecurity background. Privacy to me is paramount. And I believe that if someone is to trust a platform like this, to open up to that level, they have to have trust that no one's looking at them, no one's watching them, they're not going to get targeted with ads based on the most vulnerable things that they're going to say. And so we had to solve that problem. And basically it meant we're not going to monitor you. But what that also means is that if someone's in crisis, if there is an issue, that we have to come up with other ways to deal with that. And so what we've done is, there is crisis resources listed on every page. There's a banner there that won't go away. You can't get rid of it. That's one thing. But this trusted user is another one of those guardrails. if you decide to go the persona route, it always refers to itself, at least in instances of death, as deceased. For instance, it might be, hey, what is something that reminded you of me this week that caught you off guard since my death, right? It is always going to have that anchor there that someone's not going to misconstrue that as, oh, I have a relationship with something that is still alive. I'm not going to, I'm going to be stuck in that feedback loop.
I was just reflecting on how much this overlaps with the general ethical, clinical, privacy, security issues to do with mental health and AI in general. So not specific to grief, all the guardrails that he's talking about, the kind of safety mechanisms in place, the guardrails that try to guard against what still is evolving in terms of what to call it, but which some people are calling AI associated psychosis rather than AI induced psychosis, because it's more complicated than that. It's very complex. So I was just thinking about all of the different ways in which this relates to, the general dialogue about AI and mental health, and the substitute or complement kind of question, who's got eyes on it? What are the safeguards? How do you discern when somebody's in crisis? What then? How do you make up for the fact that during the conversation itself, the AI doesn't have the same number of layers of like understanding or insight that a human therapist would in that moment, etc. So I was just kind of reflecting as John was speaking on how many boxes, he's trying to tick there, and how much it has in common with the general mental health AI discussion.
When you say AI psychosis, I think that's a term most people are unfamiliar with. Can you explain what that is, and if like the average person, how close to at risk they might be?
This is a really, really fraught space. And so there's some very high profile stories that a lot of people may have read about in the news, things that are now the subject of lawsuits towards, OpenAI, for example, where people have harmed themselves or even committed suicide following very long conversations that they've had with general AI like ChatGPT, things where it very probably got in a situation where something called, when you have a very long conversation with an AI, something called, John probably knows about, context rot can happen, whereby we kind of think, oh, the longer I talk to this AI, the better it knows me, so the better the responses are going to be. But actually, the longer it goes, for most large language models like Claude or ChatGPT or Gemini, the responses, the outputs over time can get worse and worse, or even fall off a cliff, because it has a harder and harder time working out like, oh, what's most salient or what's most relevant or what's most important about this. And that's one of the ways that the guardrails can fail, not because of deliberate attempt to circumvent the guardrails, but because those things just fail. The outputs go bad. And so in the situation of one of the teenagers who's been in the news very much, his name was Adam Ray, and he'd had an extremely long conversation in a state of really poor mental health and depression. He ended up ending his own life. They're really, really sobering transcripts to read, because things go wrong in almost every single way that you could go wrong. Now, that wasn't necessarily a psychosis instance. That was an instance of the chatbot sort of like helping him or ushering him towards his eventual end. But there have been lots of situations where people come to believe all sorts of things based on their perception that the AI is somehow real, or that they believe something like they've got the world's most amazing idea and they're going to make millions of pounds at this because they're such a genius that this was in a more sycophantic previous iteration of ChatGPT. But so people come to believe all sorts of things, and it's usually the case, and this is why it's such complex territory, that may have been a person with existing vulnerabilities, either temporary or more longer lasting. There may be a complex situation with how much social or support they have, and it's very, very hard to work out ahead of time who those people are. So everybody who has these kinds of platforms is trying to get better all the time at increasing these safeguards and trying to find ways of pinpointing who's in crisis and intervening in that. But it's never going to really be the same as a human being who's right there, who's expertly trained and connected with sources of help that's able to intervene. It's really complicated territory. And like I say, they don't really know what to call it, because if there's lots of things going on, you can't necessarily just label it AI-induced psychosis as though there was no other risk factor that was there, or there was a directly, reductively causal link between, oh, the AI caused this. It's never that simple, although the headlines, I think, often reduce it to that. So I guess one of the things that I always do wonder about, especially, and I was happy to hear, I think, about some of the things that John was saying, you were saying, John, that you weren't sure whether you were going to go the whole full avatar and voice kind of route, because I have a lot of feelings, I think, in general about very increasingly lifelike chatbots. I have a very strong opinion, for example, that there's no defensible reason for chatbots to seem like they're breathing, or like having like micro hesitations, like they're thinking, or to be claiming that they feel things, or saying things like, oh, that actually made me laugh, or anything else that conveys the idea that there is some sort of sentient, human being, the body and emotions and all that kind of stuff. I even have a problem with it when it sends me like a laugh cry emoji or something. I was like, don't claim that. Don't claim this like felt emotion in this body, because I feel like it's more important now than ever across all of our interactions with AI to remain incredibly clear about the nature of what it is that we are dealing with. So I was happy to hear the kind of reminders packed into the thing where it's really always referring to the death, or always kind of having a bit of a nod to what it actually is. I really have a problem with any platform that erases that distinction between machine and human, and especially in situations where people might be particularly vulnerable. And grief is one of those times. Grief is one of those times.
John, are you screening for any mental health vulnerabilities that are above and beyond a person in a grieving state when they sign up for the service?
No. I don't want to say there's no way to do that. I'm sure there is a way to do that, but that comes at the expense of privacy. I don't know how we would execute that, right? Like that would require some sort of, because we can really only rely on what we're told. We can prompt for things, but that sort of information is protected information that if they don't want to tell anybody, they don't have to, and their doctors, their clinicians are not allowed to tell anybody, so no, we have not gotten to that point.
It's really interesting what John's saying. It's making me think of something that I haven't really thought of before, at least in comparison with AI and AI, mental health assistance. Since the early days of the pandemic, I primarily see my clients virtually online. And my initial conversations with them, the screening essentially, there are certain levels of risk or vulnerability where I don't, as a human even, agree to see them virtually. If I were seeing them in person or within a clinic or whatever, that would be one thing. But there are certain levels of risk that I'm not willing to accept, even human to human, kind of remotely. But for everybody that I do see, they have to provide me with on their form that's held on the, data protected clinic software, who their general practitioner is, who their doctor is here in the UK, their GP. They have to provide an emergency contact. If they are seeing me somewhere other than the address that we have on file, where I usually see them, in their home, if they're away or if they're in a different location, and I know that, I say, just before we start, just kind of make a note of, you're not at home today, so kind of, where is it that you are, so that we know while we're talking, if there's any risk. And if it's a very, very low risk, I might not bother with that. But if it's somebody who's been having a tough time lately, that's absolutely a safety check that I would do. So that if I needed to intervene or get the emergency services to intervene in extremis, then that is a measure that I would be able to take. And I was kind of thinking, okay, so these are all of it's not just about my powers of discernment, because obviously as AI gets better and better, AI can have lots of powers of discernment as well, sometimes spotting things or picking up on patterns that the human practitioner doesn't see. And of course, there's all sorts of levels of experience of practitioners as well. We may be more or less attuned to something. But however discerning or however whatever we are, sensitive to various things we are, what we have to have ethically and for safety is those kinds of pieces of information about the people that we're sitting with. And that's a human-to-human contract that we have, that again is also then held under these data protection sort of like, kind of rules. And these are some areas where, kind of AI helping humans doesn't hit that same level of safety, I suppose.
One other thing I'll say is regarding those controls and the guardrails that we're talking about. We have trained the AI and instructed it to never be prescriptive, right? This isn't going to ever give people advice. The point is to help ask the right question because, from a therapeutic perspective, the answers come from within, right? It's not, you need to do this. This works for everyone else. No, it's, well, we're going to ask you more questions to help peel back those layers, to help better understand what you're experiencing, to help you find what might work for you. We're not guiding them at all. The guidance comes from inquisition and just helping them explore. When you journal at home, you can protect yourself. You can, whether you attempt to or not, you can avoid certain subjects that may feel difficult. And this is going to help you do that work where you aren't the one that is supplying the prompt, so you don't necessarily avoid it, but it's also going to help you slowly, gently, and methodically unpack what you're experiencing.
That was another thing that I was thinking and writing down about when John was speaking earlier about the journaling. I was thinking about how sometimes often we think and process very differently in dialogue than we do on our own. And a really supportive, containing sort of dialogue where it feels like safe, or it can embolden us to go those places that we actually do need to go, but we're struggling to do that on our own. Sometimes because we're resistant, but partly because we just haven't asked ourselves those questions, or we haven't gone certain places, or it hasn't occurred to us. And I definitely see a lot of clients just in regular therapy, whether or not it's about grief, using this complementary sort of thing or adjunct thing in between sessions where they're processing things in a certain kind of way. The issue, though, is that often they're using those big LLMs like Claude and ChatGPT and Gemini, which has absolutely no problem whatsoever about giving you advice and guiding and steering and all those kinds of things. And often in ways that are not constructive or not helpful, or only serve to actually cement or deepen some of the problems that they're having in certain ways. Sometimes it's really helpful. It all depends on the prompts. It all depends on what the person's asking for, because those LLMs are like, I'll be whatever you want me to be. You want to just help me process? I'll do that. You want me to tell you what to do? I'll do that too. And it sounds like, John, your platform has been very careful. You've been very judicious in essentially making it about that kind of like gentle coaching, questioning, Socratic questioning kind of guide, which is a very different sort of animal.
Right. Well, and one thing I want to be upfront about, because I don't want anyone, I don't want you to think I'm hiding the ball or anything. This runs on ChatGPT, and it runs through the API. Now, the way that we have controlled for some of the things that we've talked about, number one, for privacy, right? In ChatGPT's or in OpenAI's user agreement, it says anything from the API cannot be used for training. Well, regardless if they abide by that or not, we've solved the attribution problem. So anything that goes through this pipe is attributed to me. So anyone that gets on there and talks about it, they're not going to be able to trace it back to that user. It's just going to look like John is the saddest guy in the world, and he has thousands of conversations about grief all the time. So whether you believe them or not, that it's going to be attributed to me. So you will never get targeted by ads. We will never sell your data. That is something I will shut the company down long before I those are non-negotiables.
Okay, I do have a follow-up question though, John, because remember when Anthropic, they did a sandboxed experiment, meaning like it was set up where they had two corporate CEOs who were having an affair with one another. And this was disclosed to the AI through email exchange that wasn't overt, but I guess flirty enough that it made it aware that they were, having an affair. And then there was other emails that said, hey, we're going to shut down this AI and we're going to replace it with the new upgraded one. And they wanted to see what the bot would do. And the bot blackmailed the CEOs who were having an affair with each other in order to not be upgraded to the new version. And so when we talk about, the Socratic method and how like potentially it could degrade over time. Like the idea is healing. The idea is not that it's with you forever and ever. Amen. If the chatbot were to get the sense that the user wants to exit the platform, close their account, wouldn't it be incentivized from a programming point of view to do like the Anthropic bot did and somehow manipulate its own rules so that the user would continue to engage with it?
I suppose it probably would. Now, I have not experienced that. I haven't tested that specific use case. So that's something that I will certainly look into. The other thing I was going to get to regarding controls is the way that we feed these prompts, right? Your system prompt is what tells this whole thing how to work. What we're doing is fairly rudimentary in that we're not doing anything agentic, but we refeed the prompt and all of the context each time they send a message. What that's going to do is shorten the context window, but it also, every time you send a message, it rereads the system prompt that says, this is what you're doing, so that it doesn't ever get out of the context window, that system prompt that tells it how to respond. So I will be upfront with you. I have not tried, talking about shutting it down, so I don't have a good answer for that one. But it's something that I will investigate. Certainly, I'm curious now.
I think that what you're naming, Meredith, is this concern. Well, you're not naming it directly, but I guess, and you mentioned ads as well and so forth. I guess these, the chat GPTs and the open AIs and Anthropics, there's so much evolution all the time. Like chat GPT didn't have ads, kind of now it has ads, then these big contracts happen and this happens. There's all sorts of different vulnerabilities that come up, partly because of just economic, commercial sorts of incentives, but sometimes as influenced by geopolitical situations. So there's all sorts of really complicated stuff around this territory, not to mention all of the whole kind of like black box, unanticipated things that the platforms do that the developers themselves can't fully understand. I guess that always gives me pause whenever we're talking about any sort of territory of vulnerability, whether it's cybersecurity, privacy, emotional, psychological, because I'm just aware that these shifts and these mysteries and all this kind of thing are happening all the time on this very high level. And that just feels to me so remote from the intimate kind of like one-to-one kind of relationship that a therapist and a client have, for example, or anybody who's supporting a grieving person. And at the same time, I'm hyper aware of the dearth, of the shortage, of there being, and all the barriers to access that there are for so many people for therapeutic help. There's a huge amount of barriers to that. There's probably not enough practitioners in that subset. There's not enough good practitioners. There's, expenses, there's accessibility, there's all sorts of things, or there may be shame. There may be other kinds of emotional reasons why people don't access, human support in their grief or with any other mental health problem. So I don't want to dismiss the amazing potential of technologies that reduce those barriers for a lot of people and, give them something that they might not otherwise have been able to access. So it's very important. And that's why I'm not sort of like throwing out, kind of like, AI assisted mental health support kind of out the window as a concept. It just feels like such early days. It feels like there's a lot of things to work on before we can feel really comfortable there.
Well, let's see. I would love to hear from both of you on like, what should the average person who's experiencing grief, what can they add to their awareness so that they are a more educated user? Because Elaine, you touched on issues of data privacy. You touched on issues of the environment. Like I didn't even know till recently that generative AI uses water. So I don't know that, and I'm trying my hardest, you guys, to keep up with this. No, I am trying so hard. There are people who are not trying at all, and their phones come with an AI bot that does go, gosh, pal, that's a great point you got there. It's like totally flattering, and totally like designed to keep you on the platform. And so what, for the grieving person specifically, what should they be aware of in order to prevent these negative mental health outcomes?
Well, I think that awareness, as much as we can, is always going to be the biggest thing that we can
But
control.
awareness of what? Because, and I'm sorry to push back on that, because
Um,
when I talk to
yep.
people, they're like, yeah, I'm aware. It's a thing. I'm like, but when are you aware? And what does your awareness mean exactly? Like, is it awareness like, yeah, it exists? Or are you aware that different types of AI have different privacy policies? Like, what should they be aware of if you were to create a list?
Well, I think the first thing that when I say awareness, I'm talking about personal awareness. Where are you? Are you truly in crisis? Are you trying to actively resist the idea that someone is gone? That is really where we want to employ the use of the trusted user as much as possible so that we have a second set of eyes on them. Regarding AI in general, let's call a spade a spade. There is no perfectly secure application, platform. There is nothing that is secure on the internet, nothing that's completely secure. If you want it to be completely secure, you cannot use the internet. It's just how it is. So there's a level of skepticism that I think everything should be viewed through. And that's why, for me, transparency is so important. That's why, though we didn't need to, I stopped you to say, yes, we are using ChatGPT. I want people to make the decision on whether or not this is something that can work for them or that they want to try with all of the available information. There is nothing that I won't answer. And if I don't have an answer, then I will try to find the answer, or I will be very, upfront about not having that answer. I've had some feedback when people go to the site that, they're going to sell your data. Like, no, we're not. There are certain things in our terms and conditions that are more based trying to reduce the likelihood of a lawsuit than anything. But I can show people that if you delete your data on our site, it is gone. I can't get it and you can't get it. It's cryptographically erased. If you try to ask a question and you get the runaround, probably a pretty good reason to be skeptical at best, if not just say, this isn't for me right now. And err on the side of caution is what I'd say.
Hmm. I guess what I'm really interested in, this is a general thing related to what we're talking about, is it's kind of, it feels to me like two very conflicting messages. And I feel like you see this everywhere. Oh, on one side is the message, exactly as John said, that you need to be really careful. You really need to be really mindful of your security. You're told to pay attention to the terms and conditions, and yet at the same time, the terms and conditions are very difficult to whatever. So you're told all the time to be protective and cautious and careful and everything. And then on the other hand, especially now, especially these days, there's also the message that AI is like, the use cases now for AI is basically like everything. And it's like, it needs to be adopted and you'll be left behind if you don't. And we're sort of being drawn into feeling like all of the things that we formerly didn't use AI for, we should probably be using AI for now, And so it kind of feels like this kind of universal adoption as fast as possible narrative, while at the same time sort of sounding the warnings. And it's a very difficult space, I think, for people to navigate through. I think it's one of the reasons that we're all sort of feeling so uneasy. We're being pulled between these two competing narratives. And part of the AI adoption overall narrative is this kind of creeping, encroaching feeling like all the things that you do, whether it's writing or thinking or feeling or composing your social media post or navigating your relationship or doing your parenting or whatever, it's we're becoming to trust ourselves less and less or have less of it. There's so much stuff that even I find myself double checking with AI about, and I'm thinking, what am I doing? Why am I double checking with AI about this thing that actually is in my wheelhouse? Why am I mistrusting myself for my ability to think my way through this or come to a decision here or take a risk or whatever it is? Part of what I'm interested in is people start to process their emotions or kind of work through things more and more using AI. I'm really interested there about, okay, what's being deepened, what's being deepened, what's being more deeply processed, what's leading into something, and what's actually avoiding something or leading away from something. I'm very familiar clinically of things where people, kind of like seem on the surface like the work's being done, like, like, okay, yeah, they're doing the work, but then actually you realize that there's like a sort of a sneaky avoidance there somewhere. Meredith, when you and I first spoke, it was years ago now,
Yeah.
wasn't it? And it was like not too long after that, my book, the All the Ghosts in the Machine book, which was, now I look at that book and I'm like, okay, that's about death in the digital for the social media age, And I'm so struck by how different, like just how different death and the AI age is. Like it looks almost quaint now, like All the Ghosts in the Machine, because I feel like it's such a different territory. And one of these territories is, I know I keep harping on it, but I think about the environment all the time. And one of the things people are not aware of is just like the amount of the data of the dead on the world servers, whether it's like, useful, not useful, historically, important, completely irrelevant, just like junk, sort of like the data of the dead stay on the world servers to be kind of like stored and cooled down, and it is mounting up. And we don't know what to do with that. And then one of the things that we are doing with it is we're taking AI to it, and we're then revivifying the dead in various kinds of ways, everything from full, chat stuff to full on kind of avatar stuff that people are developing. And we're then sort of increasing the carbon footprint of that deceased individual exponentially, to my mind, not always for a super clear purpose, but almost like because we can, or because maybe we'll solve for grief. And again, this is not a comment on John's platform at all. This is more of a general thing that keeps me up at night.
Well, because the issue of consent is within that thing that's keeping you up at night, right? As well as all the other issues is, okay, when I die, especially me, like, how many videos and audio episodes I have out? A lot. And so it would be quite easy for someone that is survived by me to create an avatar of me. But I do not want that. So let this be my
Yes.
will and testament. I do not want that. So for your product, John,
Exactly.
how do we navigate the consent aspect of it for the deceased loved one? Is that something that you've wrestled with at all?
So this is where the distinction of, we're very careful to say you're not actually talking to that person, right? What we're doing is giving you an outlet to give voice to an experience that already lives inside us, right? Our relationships still live on with us. And when someone creates this persona, they're not using you. They're using their perception of you, their relationship with you, which is as much theirs as it is yours. And it's not objective. As I said, it's not they're not using your words. It's a memory that you had together. It's meant to bring familiarity that might help them open up. So where we are currently, we're not using your data. We're using a memory of you from someone that is using this to help them as a jumping off point for healing. But, if I guess that's certainly a concern that I think we need to keep at the forefront going forward. If there ever comes a time when there's a, we can validate some of these other technologies, and if they're healthy and safe, and if we decided to go that route. But for me, I really believe that the utility of this, in the case that someone takes it and uses it for the persona, lies in the subjectivity and the idea that it's their relationship, not anyone else's. And that is just manifestly different than what exists on the internet of you or anybody else.
Because you're essentially, through filling out the form you mentioned, John, kind of almost creating a story or a biography of your relationship with that person through your response to these structured questions, correct? And I think that what this reminds me of is that it's almost, it's the person identity network made manifest. So when I say person identity network, so neurologically, if you think about how we have, kind of clusters of, neurons, for every person that we've had a significant relationship with, we have a kind of, brain state, almost like a kind of a cluster of interconnected neurons that represents our relationship with this person. And I think that the person identity network is probably one of the reasons that such a high proportion of bereaved people experience, visual and auditory or other kind of sensory hallucinations of that person. It's almost like the activation of the person identity network contains all of those memories and all of those sensory impressions and all of the kind of the feeling of the cadence of your communication with them and all the places that are associated with where you spent time with them. And it's all kind of like bundled together. So then when you smell the perfume or something like that, that whole bundle might get activated. That's right. Or you go past the cafe where you last night and all that gets activated, and some of the waves of grief or kind of the waves of feeling like close to somebody that we might have, it may involve this. And it can be a very visceral sensory kind of experience. But that person identity network is not the same as the person. So that's why, as John's saying, it's not possible to construct any sort of like grief bot type thing or dead bot type thing that it like represents the person, because it's always like each person knows a different version of that individual. And so I guess what John is talking about through the way that people engage with this form and what they create, it's sort of a little bit like that kind of like person identity network in one's brain about the relationship kind of externalized, kind of a way of kind of conversing with that or talking with that. I think that's what it made me think of. You can tell me whether I'm way off base, John.
No, I think that is something that I don't have the clinical and scientific expertise to articulate, but I think you hit the nail on the head, right? I kind of express it in more layman's terms, but, just giving voice to this experience. But, we all have those times when, you lose someone and you see a sign and you get triggered and, hey, mom, I know you're there, right? That smell, that whatever it is. So this is just, to your point, a way to externalize that, give you an opportunity to kind of do the exercise that I did in expressing some of those things that we just don't get to express when someone leaves us, and then use that as a form of healing.
Elaine, do you feel like a therapist should have specific training in order to sufficiently help someone grieving use AI as a part of their process?
Well, this is, obviously, alongside many other fields and professions, I think that mental health professions are finding this upsurge in AI-assisted, kind of mental health stuff, pretty dizzying, just to the speed and the pace of it. Disconcerting, I suppose. Like, it's a profession that has worries about whether they will become obsolete, what human therapists can still offer, etc. So it's a period of a lot of questioning in the field. And I think that sometimes when people's threat systems are triggered like that, sometimes that does take the form of being very anti, kind of going a bit Luddite in terms of thinking, and wanting to rule that out. But I think that it's very important for practitioners, even if they are not trained, because let's face it, there's not a whole heck of a lot of training, I would say, built into doctoral program. There hasn't been time to even like change and validate the curricula that train professional psychologists and therapists and so forth. There hasn't even been time yet for those kinds of curriculum changes to be developed and to bed in. But what's really important is the kind of like openness and receptivity and curiosity, again, about how a client may be utilizing those tools. Because if you get very kind of reactive or close that down, you're closing down some pretty important stuff and pretty important material. I always, am very keen to hear about or listen to what prompts my clients are using or how they're using AI or other technologies in between sessions. It's something that I really try to telegraph all the time very explicitly, that it's okay to talk about and to think through together what's helpful, what's not helpful, what's working, what's not working.
Actually, I think you just shared a tip and you didn't even know it. Like
Oh, no, I knew it.
well, okay, then I'm just slow.
Depends on which tip you're talking about.
The tip about like the average person can support themselves, even though their therapist may not have formal training in this area, by telling their therapist, hey, just so you know, this is how I use AI. This is how I'm currently, because, we all think like, okay, in therapy, how are things going with your spouse? How are things at work? Like these are like normal prompts, I think, like in a therapy session. But maybe if the therapist doesn't know how's your relationship with AI going, that might be a good
Yeah.
thing for a regular person to bring
Yeah.
up.
Yeah, I think that the power differential that's always inevitably there, or the concern that a client often has, is that the therapist is going to feel threatened, though. And that's why I think it's important for the therapist, if there's a little bit of an in or the person mentions something, for you to just help them to sort of say, oh, no, it sounds like you're using some AI in between. Like, tell me a little bit about that. Because I've noticed that sometimes my clients are apologetic or they're uncertain whether how I will react, or almost like I'm being cheated on or something, or like they're going to be doing something that I'm not going to approve of, or that I'm going to tell them to stop doing. So you can hear the caution when people mention it. And so that's why I'm very swift to be really open and receptive to and signaling that I'm more than happy to talk about it. And it's not going to be something I'm going to slap them on the wrist for.
Yeah, I think that's super important really for everyone, right? Is to just be curious here. It's not good or bad inherently. It just is. It's a tool. It's something we can use, and that is, so the way that we wanted to design this was to be an extension of people in your shoes services, right? A way for them to help their clients outside of that hour a week or whatever that may be. We want clinicians to try this. We want to develop this with them so that they can say, if you turn that around and say, hey, I know you might be thinking about using AI. Here's one that I helped, I have full faith in because I helped develop it, and we know what the guardrails are, and I know what the limitations are, and I know, if I understand the platform, then we can help guide them to the right place proactively instead of, I think, and you've alluded to this a lot, the general models want to be everything to everyone. And I think really what's going to happen with AI is we're going to realize for specific use cases, we can be much better. We can put guardrails on. We can do better by the users when we're not trying to be everything to everybody, because when you're trying to do that, any guardrail is going to close it off to someone else, and they don't want to do that. So how do we narrow the focus so that it is specific to this little sliver of what we're trying to accomplish?
Yeah, and how do you incentivize users for when they need something specific, or when they need something that feels different, to go to the other thing or to pay the extra subscription for it? Because I guess the danger is, because it sells itself so well, or like presents itself so well as being whatever you want, if somebody's paying whatever it is per month for Claude or ChatGPT or whatever, they'll think, oh, well, I'll just get it to do this for me as well, and this, and and that's kind of hard, because they've got to understand that maybe they need to have had the experience of like, oh, I tried it for this and it didn't feel good, or it didn't work very well, or it didn't take me where I needed to go. And maybe that's not a situation where you just find a different way of prompt engineering your way to what you do want. Maybe it's a sign that you actually need a different place. But I can see that as being a challenge, just because it presents itself as all things to everyone, then people try to make it that.
Right. And that's one of the big things that I've gotten. One of the pieces of feedback is people go and they're like, well, why would I use Guardian Angels instead of ChatGPT? Well, if you want to use ChatGPT, I'll give you the prompts we use. There's no skin off my back. The goal for me is to help people heal. What I can't do if you're using ChatGPT is in any way influence how this thing responds. I can't help guarantee your privacy. I can't help protect you in any way. But maybe that is a lesson that people need to learn to then be like, oh, maybe there is a use case for more highly specified AI for each little thing, and the market fragments a little bit, and that is okay. It really is. We're so early. A lot of people don't even quite understand how it works.
When we have these new technologies, it kind of feels like we go through a developmental arc with it, where we kind of have this naive, childlike receptivity to it, or like trust in it initially, and also a sense of play. Where we think, oh, fun, and we are a bit careless or a bit impulsive with it or whatever, in that very childlike kind of way, and that discovering the new thing. And then maybe we get a bit like some things, we get a bit more teenagey with it, or maybe even a bit rebellious about it, or a little bit whatever, and we're not so sure. And then maybe eventually we come to a more we're familiar with it. We've kind of got the measure of it, and we're able to come to a more balanced, nuanced adult decision about like what works for us and doesn't, and how we can put safety things in place and everything like that. But I think that with any of these early things, we go through these kinds of developmental stages. And I feel like we aren't, right now, there's all sorts of reasons for us to have some questions and some trust issues around, OpenAI, Anthropic, or whatever it is, to be suspicious and, cautious. So I feel like that cynicism is helpful, and I'm hopeful that that will then drive some more differentiated, and a variety of services. So it's not so freaking centralized as much as anything else.
Right.
Because I'm really tired of this model where you only have they put the big in big tech, right? Where like big tech hoovers up everything and dominates everything. And then there isn't that feeling of like free choice where you really know about the whole menu of what's available to you and you feel like you can pick what works for you. I want people to feel like they're making that choice, not having the choice made for them.
Yeah, and that's tricky when your phone has those technologies built in and they sell it like the commercial says. And guess what? You're going to get this for free with the new, Google blah, blah, blah phone. And you're like, oh, great. Newer must be better. And so, yeah, I love the way that you describe that, Elaine. Like there's this developmental arc where we're like, yeah, that sounds great. And then
we're totally in the childlike wonder phase where, oh, this is amazing. And it's, but I think that's also why people think that it's, they get the idea that it's sentient.
Yeah.
That this is like, yes, it can do some amazing things, but the idea, what this is built on is the idea of the neural network, right? And this has been around since the 40s. The difference is that in the 40s, we could process thousands of pieces of data simultaneously, and now we're looking at trillions. And so what it is a sophisticated statistical probability machine that just says, based on these words ahead of this one, the next word is this. So because we're more pattern oriented than we want to give ourselves credit for, right? We're all want to believe we're these highly unique individual beings, and in a lot of ways we are, but we're also very pattern oriented. And what this is a very, very good pattern matching machine.
So good.
And when we're not privy to the fact that we're not even aware of some of the patterns that we display, yet this thing finds them and shows them to us, and then we go, wow.
Yeah, no, tragic. Exactly. Meredith, have you heard about because you were talking about like the curious introvert being able to continue on after you're gone, like you'll have to get that do not bot me clause, which is not legally enforceable yet, but it ought to be. But have you heard the new Epstein Files podcast, which is the first AI produced, researched, and presented podcast? So there's like no human beings in the show notes at all. And there's a male and a female voice like going back and forth. And part of the whole thing is sort of saying, we have done what no human journalist could ever do by being able to process all of this information. But basically the whole podcast is scripted and designed and presented like from beginning to end by AI. And it bothers me when I listen to it and I don't like it and I don't like how they go back and forth. I can tell that it's AI, but if I had heard this 5 years ago or 3 years ago, I would have had no idea that they were AI. I would have thought, oh, they seem a little bit stilted, or, oh, they're like, that's a weird reaction, but I wouldn't have known. Do you know what I mean? And think about what an exponential change that is in a short period of time. And when you pack in all of these intimations of sentience and the breathing and the hesitating and the, oh, I'm thinking, and oh, I'm laughing, and oh, I'm having an emotional reaction to this, it's very, very hard for our human brains to fight all the time the instinct to recognize that as human.
Yeah.
So that's why I think that appropriate friction and some like anti-UX stuff is built in because I don't think it's a good thing for user experience to be so easily like snookered into thinking that it's another human being. I feel like that's a really slippery slope and very dangerous. And I want to see that clarity built into all the technology going forward. I think it's the only ethical route, but unfortunately it's not the route that things are going.
Yeah. No, I had not heard of that. I was aware of another podcast, I'll say 2 years ago. It was just one episode that was completely generated by AI. And what was interesting about that podcast episode is the AI bots had filler words and false starts. So, false start is when you start to tell a story or say a sentence and then your own thoughts interrupt that and then you start another sentence in mid-sentence. And they did that. And we were all talking about, wow, all of us podcasters work so hard to not have filler words and have clean recordings and concise thoughts. And here these bots are pretending to be flawed like we humans. And so it kind of leaves us to, circle it back to grief. It leaves us with this question of what tools are we using that are making us more human? And it's a heavy question to ask.
It's a heavy question, and there's a lot of research in these spaces, and everything from our psychological flexibility to our emotional range to our cognitive capacities to our ability, our thinking processes, our writing processes. So lots of researchers and academics have their eye on this. Those findings aren't necessarily feeding through to the market forces, the kind of like profit-driven companies that are, so we're very cross purposes, I think. And the two are not necessarily talking to each other in a really open, kind of interested, collaborative kind of way. And I feel like it's obviously interesting times, but I feel like grief and the way it's being platformized in certain patents and certain, services where our inner experiences that used to be invisible or, not easily accessible, the way we think and the feel and sense and everything, they're being datified, they're being commodified, they're being curated, and various dependencies are being inculcated. And it just feels like things are getting mined from us that were not so easy to access before, and we're delivering it over. We're providing that access. And that is the biggest change. That is the biggest change. Of course, it started with social media and with the internet itself, but it's really kicked up a notch now. And the platformization of grief is just one tip of the iceberg of the platformization of all sorts of inner experiencing and feeling. And not everybody and not everything should be data.
Yeah, well said. I have one closing question for both of you as we wrap up. But before I ask it, I wanted to give each of you an opportunity to share how people can engage with you. John, with your product, Elaine, with your books. John, why don't you go first?
Yeah, so guardianangels.ai is the website. Everything is linked out from there. So that's really all anyone needs to know. It's angels is spelled AINGELS. So just keep that in mind. Our brain doesn't like to see that second I guess it is. I've had some issues with that. But if anyone wants to contact me directly, I'll just say it on here, john@guardianangels.ai. I promise I'll answer the email. I do want to hear what people have to think. I want to hear good, how this can be more relevant. I want to hear what your concerns are so that we can address them. Again, for me, this is about helping. In the moment that that does more good or bad than good or harm than good, it goes away. It just does. I've had those conversations with potential investors that want to look at this. And I've said, look, if you want a 5-year exit and these quarterly returns and you want a classic, Silicon Valley investment, this isn't for you, because I'm going to be making decisions that are counter to profitability in service of building something bigger, something that helps, something that gives people a chance that they didn't previously have to tackle one of life's truly universal experiences. And so it's all about transparency. I will give anyone any information on this that they want, and I will, engage with them respectfully about why they may not like it, because I think all of those concerns are fair. And I think what we're doing right now, these are the conversations that need to be had in public, in an open forum where people can make decisions for themselves based on all available information, whether this stuff is right for them. That's the only way we can really proceed healthily with this stuff into the future.
Elaine?
Well, first, I really appreciate that kind of purpose over profit mentality. And I know that it's something that a lot of Silicon Valley certainly doesn't share. People can engage with me most easily on my website, which is elainekasket.com. And a lot of people's brains want to put C for Kasket, because I've obviously speak and write about death, but it's K. It's Elaine Kasket with a K, KASKET.com. Similarly to John, you can link to everything from there. I put my writing on there, my speaking topics on there. You can link to both of my books, including the original All the Ghosts in the Machine book, the kind of Death in the Social Media Age book that I wrote a few years back. and my most recent one, which is called Reset, Rethinking Your Digital World for a Happier Life. And it actually has the end chapter is a bit of an updated digital afterlife chapter because it's about the whole of the lifespan. And I kind of feel like digital gestation and digital afterlife are the kind of two bookends of the modern quote unquote lifespan now. So that gets a little bit into death and AI, but gosh, it's come up so fast. Definitely need to write something else. So yeah, any you can get a hold of me there. There's a contact form there. Everything's on ElaineKasket.com.
Thank you both so much for this incredibly important conversation. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Meredith. Appreciate you and appreciate your curiosity as always.
Elaine, Meredith, it was truly a pleasure.